Well, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. Poland has sought billions in EU-backed loans to strengthen its defense capabilities as part of a pan-European security program. But President Nawrocki has vetoed the implementation of that plan. Now, Prime Minister Donald Tusk warns that if Eurosceptic parties win the 2027 elections, Poland could exit the EU, putting both funding and broader security cooperation at risk. Joining us now to explore all the stakes is Aleks Szczerbiak, Professor of Political Science at the University of Sussex. Good to have you with us here on TVP World. Welcome.
Good morning, Sascha. It's good to be back.
So, in a sense, the political campaign is well underway, in a sense. If we're looking at some of the comments by Minister Sikorski, the foreign minister, just on Monday, saying very much this rhetoric painting Brussels and the EU as a greater threat than Vladimir Putin, that's dangerous territory. So, first of all, how do we react to that statement, and how realistic do you think an actual Polexit is at this juncture?
Okay, so I think this is a framing tactic by Mr. Sikorski and the Tusk government, framing this whole debate around the issue of Polexit. And I think there are three reasons for this. And the first one is because it puts them on the right side of public opinion. 60, 70, 80% of Poles are in favour of Poland remaining within the EU. It's a way of leveraging an issue to put themselves on the right side of public opinion, trying to turn the next election into a referendum on EU membership. It's also secondly, a very difficult issue for the right-wing opposition because their supporters are divided on this issue more or less 50-50. So they can't be seen to be coming out in favour of Polexit, but it means that they're very much on the defensive and having to kind of explain themselves the whole time and saying, no, we're not in favour of Polexit, we're in favour of asserting Poland's interests on particular issues, but we want Poland to remain within the EU. So it puts them on the back foot. And thirdly, I think it's a way of basically distracting from the government's problems with domestic issues. A lot of its supporters are frustrated that reforms haven't been introduced at the pace that they were meant to be, whereas they could be quite easily mobilised around the question of defending Poland's membership of the EU. I don't think it's a realistic prospect in the short term. I don't think that's going to happen, but I don't think that's really the objective. The objective is a political one, to use this issue as what political scientists call a wedge issue, to kind of leverage the fact that most Poles are in favour of the EU to put the opposition on the back foot.
Right. You mentioned framing, but it is also more the framing from the opposition. We're looking at Law and Justice, but also the far-right confederation. We've heard this many times as well. But back to President Nawrocki, I mean, this is someone very much backed by Law and Justice. This cohabitation between the government and presidency has been a difficult one. But I think in case of, maybe he hasn't said it directly, but if we take those safe loans, so this EU-backed loans for actually providing for a lot of very low-interest money for defense projects across Poland and also with other projects in the European Union. But nevertheless, he framed it very much. The president said he wants it to be about sovereignty, right? 100% Polish sovereignty. Now, that argument, in a way, could be interpreted, well, we can only have sovereignty if we really are ourselves sovereign, not part of the EU. So is this part of, I mean, the framing, but is this part of his game in a sense? Is that the tactic?
I don't think that it's his objective to try and log roll to lay the ground for a future Polexit. I think that Mr. Nawrocki and the right-wing opposition are very, very critical of the EU on a whole series of issues, not just on this on the SAFE programme, but things like migration policy, climate policy. He just made a statement earlier about the the ETS scheme, about the way that the EU gets involved in rule of law issues in Poland. I think there's a whole series of issues where they're very, very critical of the EU, but I don't think it's certainly not on Mr. Nawrocki's agenda, and it's not on the agenda of most of the leaders of the Law and Justice Party, maybe a bit more so in terms of confederation, to actually pursue Polexit at the current time. And I think what they're really trying to do is they're trying to present these as Simply, these are kind of democratic disagreements, if you like. These are disagreements that you can have within the European Union about its trajectory, about particular policies, particularly if in conflict with the national interest in their views. But their problem is it's quite a complicated argument. I mean, the argument you've just presented, particularly over something like SAFE, it's cheap loans, it's money that can be accessed very, very quickly. It's something that the military wants. It's quite a simple argument, and it puts the opposition on the back foot. I think their arguments about things like sovereignty, about the restrictions that there are on the ability to spend this, about the fact that there might be leverage, conditionality attached to it. This is a more complicated argument for the opposition to make, which is why the government is so keen to push this as embodying an issue that really brings this kind of Polexit question to life.
Mm-hmm. Let's focus on that word, or part of the word. If we go on also into Brexit, that was in 2016 for the UK. There were also emotional things said then. The rhetoric was also quite intense. 2 points, if you can tell us. One, do you see parallels at the moment with what you're hearing on the political discourse in Poland, what you saw at the beginnings of the campaign for the referendum in Brexit? And my second point would be, if there were such a thing in Poland, if it would exit, how would Poland do? Could it, let's say, economically, politically, survive such a thing?
Yeah, interesting question. So I think, at the moment we're not in the kind of the same place that Britain was. I mean, Poles are much more instrumental about EU membership than they were when Poland joined. When Poland joined, there was a very kind of emotional element to this. It was about making a historical civilizational choice about rejoining the West, which culturally and spiritually Poles felt that they'd always been part of. I think it's much more instrumental now. I think now Poles see it much more in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, in terms of how much money are we getting out of the EU, what kind of market access are we getting. So I think that at the moment, and the reason that Poles are overwhelmingly in favour of the EU still, if you ask them that simple question, at the moment, most Poles think that cost-benefit analysis is coming down in favour of membership of the EU. But that could change. If, for example, Poland found itself no longer a net beneficiary from the EU budget. And at that point, I think it would be much easier to make the argument that actually, Poland doesn't benefit from this as much as it did when it joined. And already, I think, the opposition is making that argument on things like climate policy, which they're saying is very, very costly. It's kind of negating a lot of the benefits that Poles gets from EU membership. Migration, again, this is taking a key sovereign decision about whether we control our borders out of Poland's hands. So we're not in that place at the moment. I think we're a very long way from where Britain was when it kind of embarked on the Brexit debate. But if that cost-benefit analysis should change in the next few years, for example, if Poland should become a net contributor to the EU budget, that could change very, very quickly, because I think Polish support for the EU is very broad, but I also think it's very shallow.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's very much in the future. I mean, if we're looking at elections, those are likely around the corner in 2027. So even if that new EU budget, I mean, Poland would still come out on top in terms of actually getting more than it puts in. So if we're just doing the cost-benefit analysis, Poland still retains, I think, its lion's share of those funds that come from the European Union. And now with the defense loans, but if we look at it, this is the interesting thing here, that, I mean, if we're looking long-term, yes, but now looking at what's happened, Poland, market access, funding, these SAFE loans, which are now in limbo, do you think that generally the Polish electorate will, when it comes down to it, realize that there's more benefits from the EU, or will they go more towards these issues, as we mentioned, migration and harsher policies from the right? Which one's going to be more appealing? I know we're a bit ways, but which one do you think will win out at the end?
Well, I think in some respects, some of the policies that the EU are pursuing kind of muddy the waters in terms of, to the extent that Poland is unambiguously a beneficiary. For example, climate policy, which the critics of EU membership say it actually adds enormous costs to to Polish businesses, to Polish consumers, which kind of negates the benefits that Poles get from, for example, regional aid, which Poland is a very large beneficiary of. The Mercosur trade agreement, for example, which hits the economic interests of a lot of Polish farmers. So it's actually, even on the economic side, it's not such a simple argument, I think, for the supporters of EU membership to make. But I still think that Poles do consider that even all these things, bearing these things in mind, the cost-benefit analysis does, as you say, come down in favour of EU membership. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. The key thing is what most Poles think. So I think the short term, that's not going to change. I think that's not for supporters of the EU. That's not problematic, which is why the government is so keen to leverage this issue. I think one of the problems that's developing, though, is that it's becoming increasingly difficult for the centre right to develop an enthusiastic pro-EU narrative. I think a lot of the things that they say about the EU are very, very critical. And although they say, yes, we still want Poland to be a member of the EU, that sort of comes after a lot of very critical comments about the EU. And I think this is potentially a problem. And this is one of the risks, I think, of what the government is doing. In a sense, it's kind of driving the political right further into the Eurosceptic camp, which is electorally very advantageous to it in the short term, but in the longer term could create a problem in terms of where the debate on EU membership ends up. And this is something that did happen in Britain. It became much more difficult for the right to develop a pro-EU narrative, and that's what could be waiting for Poland down the track.
Right, so still politics ahead of us before that big question. Much more we'll debate. But look, thanks for all those insights today. It was a pleasure. Aleks Szczerbiak there, professor from the University of Sussex. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. But stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.